Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook. This podcast was sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. In 1890, half of the U.S. government's budget was devoted to disability pensions for Civil War veterans. This enormous financial burden, combined with medical advances, led to a different approach when it came to the U.S. Army's care of wounded soldiers in World War I. Far from the passive convalescent homes of previous wars, in World War I, the U.S. Army's commitment to rehabilitation would mark a new chapter in the care of the wounded. To tell us more about these rehabilitation programs, we are joined by Dr. Sanders Marble of the Office of Medical History, U.S. Army Medical Command. Welcome, Dr. Marble, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I just need to say the following, that the views I'm expressing are mine and mine alone and do not reflect official policy or position of the Department of the Army, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
And I just want to thank you, too, for returning to the podcast because you have done some other episodes with us on some other medical aspects of World War I history. So we are very delighted to have you back here again with us today to talk about this. Now, in the intro, I mentioned the financial cost of a passive convalescent system and the medical advances that were in place by World War I. But there's also something called the 1917 War Risk Insurance Act that I wasn't aware of until we started talking about this episode. So can you tell us more about this act and the role that it plays in shaping the Army's commitment to the wounded?
Sure. The Bureau of War Risk Insurance is a very little-known government agency. The act made the government responsible not just for life insurance, which is, in the century or so since, has been converted into a death gratuity, as well as what's now called service members group life insurance, but, quote, the physical ability of soldiers and sailors, end quote. Now that's a short phrase, only 6 words, but take that little thing and think about all the implications that has. It's a real challenge to the government. What does that mean? Is it only physical? Where is the boundary between physical and mental? So you're taking insurance, which is kind of a business idea. Insurance can make a company whole after loss or damage, and war risk insurance would make a company whole after a war-related loss or damage of their property. And now you're applying the idea of like property loss to human bodily function. And businesses are about money, so money is pretty much an appropriate way to compensate a business. But how do you make a person whole? Now, the Bureau of War Risk Insurance was mostly set up to handle damage to ships and their cargo. It did not have medical facilities. I don't think it was ever intended to have medical facilities. So some other government agency or agencies would have been involved in doing whatever medical work needed to be done. Now, back in 1917, the Public Health Service had hospitals, but the Army and Navy had medical facilities in the U.S., and they would also have medical facilities over in France where the fighting was going to be. So they would be involved in the casualty care earlier, and then it's probably easier to keep the person in one system than to say, well, this part of your care is in the Army system, and when you get back for your prolonged care, we're going to hand you over to the Public Health Service. I think it just made sense to keep them in one hospital system. But then the policy gets extended at the back end in the U.S. to things that are pretty clearly not military. So you have a military system that makes sense at the front, but it's also doing things that really don't make a whole lot of military sense later on in the war.
Do we have any idea how many U.S. soldiers were wounded in World War I, or just a rough estimate of how many needed rehabilitation?
Yes and no. About 204,000 service members were wounded, including being gas casualties. People categorize that sometimes differently, sometimes not. I don't really know a way to really readily tell how many of them needed rehab, because you could be injured if your earlobe was shot off, and that doesn't need a whole lot of rehab. But part of the number that needed it circles back to why they're doing the rehab. They want to fix people's problems so that there are no long-term claims on the government. So if you're injured in training, and that wouldn't be a wound, injury, you are eligible for rehabilitation. If you're sick in some way that rehabilitation would help, you should have gotten rehabilitation. If there was anything that rehabilitation could help, you're supposed to get into the rehab. So just the number of wounded is likely going to be part of that, but other people would be eligible too. And you also have different doctors having different opinions, just as we do today. Doctors' opinions would vary widely, often from a patient's view. Once the war is over, a lot of guys who might have benefited from some therapy wanted out of the Army. And the Army is then in position, or the Navy as well, because some of these would be sailors and Marines. The military is in the position of saying, stay in the hospital against your will. We're going to get you better against your will. And the service member could then say, well, I'm going to write my congressman because I don't think I want to be here. So do you lock people up to send them to rehabilitation? No. That doesn't make sense. The Army very quickly, after the war, when people want out, the Army says, okay, we're not going to keep you if you don't want to be here. We're going to try and convince you that we can help you. But if you really want out, just sign this piece of paper saying that you will never make a claim against the government for that condition. Again, going back to that liability idea. And then you can get discharged from the hospital and from the Army. I don't know if those sort of quit claims were ever enforceable or if later legislation superseded them, but I found that slightly amusing.
So the VA doesn't exist in World War I. Does the Army, though, have facilities in the United States ready for the returning war wounded to deal with this?
Not when the war starts. The peacetime Army medical system, hospital system, is sized, as you'd expect, for the peacetime force. That's how we do it today. We don't have a lot of doctors and nurses sitting around twiddling their thumbs waiting in case there's a war. We have a system to support peacetime force and then plans to mobilize extra capacity. But in 1917, they quickly figure out, hey, we need hugely more capacity than we had before. So they get into building more hospitals at the training camps, some leasing hospital buildings and other facilities to use as hospitals away from training camps. And they spread them out around the country so that patients can be reasonably close to home. But the Army also does not have the right facilities for rehabilitation. Most of the pre-war military hospitals were for short-term care. You have a broken leg, we'll put you in the hospital until your leg mends, maybe a month, but not long-term rehabilitation and aftercare. So they also have to get in the right equipment and supplies, and also to figure out the kinds of people they're going to need, because they very certainly do not have the right skills in the people that they have in the military in 1917.
Who are some of the leading figures that are putting together this new system for the Army?
Policy level involves some big names. President Wilson is involved a little bit. Secretary of the Treasury McAdoo is involved more. I think that's because of the war risk insurance being a money thing and just funding being a money thing. The Secretaries of War and Navy are involved. A number of big name doctors of the time are involved. For instance, the Franklin Martin, who set up the American College of Surgeons, not single-handedly, but deeply involved. The Mayo brothers were involved in setting the policy. Some of the policy goes through the Council on National Defense, which included labor leaders like Samuel Gompers. And I think his involvement also leads to a moment where they were considering whether industrial war workers, what they termed the, quote, industrial army, end quote, should be covered. I think labor people would have liked that. And doctors, of course, wouldn't have minded the fees, but the government said no, only government personnel, military personnel would be covered by this. The Army jumps in pretty quickly. The declaration of war in April of 1917, in August 1917, which is months before U.S. troops are in action, the Army appoints Dr. Frank Billings, who was a former president of the American Medical Association. He's appointed to be a colonel, and he's put in charge of a Department of Special Hospitals and Rehabilitation within the Army Medical Department. Now, Billings is not going to do it all himself, but as a senior and well-connected doctor, he's got the clout to get the right people around the table. So those were sort of the people in the policy, and you getting down to actually treating patients. You find some of the early orthopedists in America, like Joel Goldthwait, MD, heavily involved. Another surgeon, Vilray Blair, who was a plastic surgeon, did some of the very early facial reconstruction in this country, is involved. And also people who did physical therapy and occupational therapy. those two specialties had not really differentiated into different training programs as they have today. But some of the major figures in starting both physical and occupational therapy in the US get a lot of their clinical experience in World War I. And they are sitting at the table in meetings with these senior people, which gets them more prominence and I think helps build understanding and knowledge about what skills they have and what they can do for the patient.
Very interesting. Now, you've mentioned physical therapy, you've mentioned occupational therapy. What counts as rehab? And you mentioned earlier, too, that there's some things involved in there that we might not tend to think of as traditional rehab today. So, what counts as rehab?
That's a short question, which also needs, unfortunately, a fairly long answer. And my short answer is pretty much anything that gets you better. The government's goal was, quote, maximum benefit of hospitalization, end quote, which meant that you could stay in a government facility paid for, receiving pay, receiving food, receiving care, as long as you were progressing. So the question then is, when does that progress end? For a broken leg, we have a pretty good idea of when the bone is knit together. X-rays can show that. But do you feel better? So how far should muscle strengthening go if you've lost some muscle? Another complication was that they added vocational programs onto the end, not just the end, but into the whole mix of rehabilitation. Because if you lost some ability, the government said, well, we should offer you the chance to train for another job so that you can support yourself, support a family if you have one, and be a contributing member of society rather than needing that disability pension that they were very conscious of from the Civil War generation. So they add in vocational programs. Those we still do, but those are done by the Veterans Administration. Now it's the Department of Veterans Affairs, called VA by a lot of people, but that didn't exist then. So the government's doing this. The military is the people the government's assigning to take care of the patient. So they say to the military, congratulations, you're now going to do vocational training courses. How much vocational training should an individual do? Who gets to choose which classes the person takes? I suspect there was some discussion between doctor and patient, but also in many cases in this rather paternalistic era, the doctor made the final decision. But going back to that phrase, maximum benefit of hospitalization, if I want to take classes, is that part of maximum benefit? Or if I'm instead doing it to milk the system with getting food and pay and housing, who gets to decide when that ends? I think there was a lot of room for disagreement. So in some ways, it's very open-ended, but it's also quite limited compared to today because the medical capabilities of the age were limited. They couldn't do transplants. So now we can do even hand and arm transplants. They couldn't do those. They didn't have much in the way of hearing aids, for instance. So there are limits on what they can do for you. And they say, if you have gone as far as we can treat you, you're done. You may want to stay. You may get better from some vocational program, but they tended to lean towards the physical improvement rather than the vocational training part. And eventually they decide that a year of hospitalization is probably going to get you as good as you're going to get. Now, they recognize there would be exceptions. So they have what looks like an arbitrary time limit, but then they do make exceptions to that. And I think that was an informed choice. They didn't just throw darts at a board and it ended up in 1 year. It was an informed choice given the capabilities of medicine and surgery at the time. I don't think that was unrealistic. And for some folks, there really is no care. Maximum benefit is reached very early on. Psychiatric patients for whom there really wasn't much care at the time, but were often discharged very quickly from the federal hospital system, often to a state mental hospital, because if there's no effective treatment, you have hit the limits of maximum benefit of hospitalization right away.
In terms of battlefield medicine, we know that the U.S. had the benefit of learning from other countries who'd been fighting for years. Was the rehabilitation program adapted in a similar way, or was it very unique to the U.S.?
There were some parts I think we got directly from others. Some elements evolved in parallel, and I think some things we largely ignored. Now, that's really vague, so let me look into some details. I mentioned Ray Blair. Some of the early American plastic surgeons worked for months at the British Maxillofacial Hospital and learned reconstruction techniques. Similarly, a lot of the orthopedic techniques used on both sides of the war were evolving in the same lines. If you look at the prostheses the Germans used, they look a lot like the prostheses that Americans are using. And some of that's just the materials that they had. Wood is one thing, metal is metals are others. There's just so many things that they could do with the technology of the day. The clinical literature is very international then, very international now, so that shouldn't be too surprising to us. The physiology is the same wherever we're born. The differences come in more in the social end of things. The Germans, for instance, had a social insurance scheme, sort of a workman's comp system, dated back to Bismarck in the 1870s and 80s, that provided for industrial workers. The U.S. did not have that. The British had a different idea, again, about payments for injured workers. And those are not specifically military. We don't think of a soldier as a worker in uniform, but those things do go and affect the societal expectations of how far rehabilitation should go, because if you have a social insurance payment waiting for you after your treatment can go a different distance or direction. And they affect, because to some degree, we do think of soldiers and sailors as workers in uniform, because if they're injured, then they should get kind of the care that a worker should. So what's fair for a veteran? What's fair for a worker? Those can be different.
So overall, how successful is the Army's rehabilitation program?
I'm going to say that's hard to say. The military treated lots of patients. It got them mostly better. Obviously, there wasn't much they could do for psychiatric casualties. And for many of them, it got them lots better. The therapy they got, the vocational classes they got, they're not likely to be useless. But how far? That's an individual question. The big effort, the big government-wide effort, helps jumpstart rehabilitation in the United States. I don't think it ultimately saved the Treasury money. So if you're thinking about it as a saving the government money question, I don't think it did that. But World War I veterans care and benefits is something that you should probably talk to Jennifer Keene about. But the program is successful for the patients, not necessarily for the taxpayer.
So overall, how would you describe the legacy then of the program?
I think it jump-started rehabilitation in the U.S. It was coming along very gradually, but the government legitimized it, brought it prominence, brought it funding, brought more people in. I think it helped things in Europe as well because they learned from us. European countries had patients needing care and could learn from what we were publishing. I think it also shows us a little bit of the hubris of the policymakers. They were thinking they could get ahead of a problem and just wall it off and avoid the whole problem. And that's a great goal. Problems avoided are much better. But the situation was dynamic and changing, and they thought it was static. They didn't think further ahead. It was foreseeable that some patients would not be fully healed. And they weren't thinking, what is the social contract between the government and the government as the representatives of the American people and the soldiers and sailors and Marines who were not fully healed. At the individual level, I think there are possibly hundreds of thousands of individual answers to that question. My grandfather was gassed, and while there wasn't much that could be done for him, there wasn't much done for him, so they did what they could. I never met him, but nothing I've heard about him suggests that being gassed and getting the treatment made any real difference to him. Another example, I found a photo of a doughboy in a very complicated arm splint and was able, by having his name, to dig up a little bit of detail on him. He had been a farm laborer before the war, gets wounded, spent about a year, that magical sort of arbitrary 1 year. He's getting physical therapy, he's getting vocational training. He comes out of it as a bookkeeper. So he has moved up at least the income ladder. Presumably farm laborers in Alabama were not particularly well paid. Those are facts about him, but I don't know how he felt about it. And I don't know that we could get into the ideas about how these people thought about the treatment they got.
Any final thoughts on the rehabilitation of wounded soldiers after World War I?
I think it's always hard to figure out what one group of people owe another group of people. There are economic and moral aspects involved in this, and it's really hard to balance economics against morals. The system in the U.S. has changed a lot from 1918. but we are still influenced by the legacy of the decisions they made.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Marble, for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email macarthurmemorial@norfolk.gov.